Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are going straight into one of the most intellectually challenging and frankly emotionally complex areas of modern discourse.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
It's a topic that sits right at the intersection of identity, trauma, and accountability.
All the big ones.
Yeah, and these are concepts that are often deemed too radioactive, maybe, or just too delicate to discuss openly without immediately, inviting moral judgment.
And that avoidance, that freezing effect you're talking about, is precisely what we're going to investigate today.
Right.
I mean, a culture that's just saturated with information where moral shortcuts are, they're prized for their speed.
Mm-hmm.
We really need to ask a fundamental and I think pretty unsettling question.
Uh-huh.
How do we distinguish between genuine verifiable harm and, well, the strategic reframing of past choices to get some kind of new moral leverage?
And our mission today is a really in-depth, almost surgical analysis of a paper by scientific analyst Justin Lake.
A paper called Narrative Immunity?
Exactly. And Lake argues that a social shortcut has emerged, a powerful mechanism that, in his words, punishes clarity, it stalls inquiry, and it fundamentally threatens our systems of accountability.
So we're going to unpack his core assertion.
We are. The idea that when victimhood becomes a permanent, non-negotiable identity instead of, a temporary condition.
An event that happened to you.
Right. The structural integrity of accountability just collapses.
So this deep dive is really tailored for you, the listener. Our goal is to gain knowledge quickly but thoroughly by looking at how language, power, and identity are strategically used as tools.
And he's clear they can be necessary tools.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, they were essential to protect genuinely vulnerable people.
But they can also be used to shield the opportunistic.
And to rewrite an inconvenient history, we're going to dissect the social mechanics that allow what looks like moral failure to occur without, triggering the consequences you'd expect.
We're presenting Lake's argument in full detail, and we should say right at the top that, yes, many of his conclusions are highly controversial.
They really challenge some deeply entrenched moral assumptions we have about public discourse.
Okay, so let's get into his core argument. Part 1.
Moral immunity and procedural paralysis.
Let's start with Lake's opening premise. It's a structural critique. He's not really critiquing people, but the ethical systems we use.
Right.
He states, pretty much point blank, that accountability, the ability to review, to question, to apply consequences, it just collapses when victimhood shifts.
Shifts from a temporary condition.
A description of an event.
To a permanent defining identity.
We all agree that being harmed is absolutely real, but Lake insists that being questioned afterward is also supposed to be, a fundamental balancing part of any justice system.
That is a crucial distinction. Lake is talking about a societal expectation, not a legal one necessarily.
So historically, what would happen?
Well, historically, when a system is damaged, let's say by a crime, the system demands symmetry. The victim is supported, of course, but the accused is questioned.
And Lake observes that the fusion we see today, it just eliminates that second step.
It does. The concept of victimhood has been kind of bolted right next to these moral absolutes that society deems non-negotiable.
Things like racism, sexism.
Child abuse.
Yeah.
Things that are unequivocally and universally condemned.
And that fusion is what creates what Lake calls a, quote, dead zone for inquiry.
It's an incredibly efficient social shortcut. It creates this tremendous social leverage because the fusion allows an individual to move fluidly between completely contradictory roles.
Okay, so what does he mean by role shifting?
He calls that the problem. An individual can operate as an actor when it benefits them, making calculating, aggressive, or maybe just self-serving choices.
And then
instantly transform into a victim when consequences show up.
Yeah.
They deploy the shield of moral immunity to just halt any inquiry into those prior choices.
So the flexibility itself is the failure mode.
It is.
So if I'm tracking Lake correctly here, he's saying the moment you invoke that victim label, you're not just pausing the debate.
Yeah.
You're invoking a social prohibition on inquiry itself. Is that what he means by procedural paralysis?
That is precisely what he means. The fluidity is the engine, but the actual consequence is what Lake labels procedural paralysis.
And what does that look like?
Well, the moment that protective word victim is invoked, the whole conversation, the investigation, the organizational review, it all just freezes.
The system, or even just the audience, is now prohibited from looking into motives or prior actions.
Or the benefits that the person got from the original transaction. Any pattern of behavior that might complicate the clean narrative of harm It's all off the table.
And if you try to examine it, you are immediately framed as cruel.
Or worse, a bigot.
So you stop being a critical thinker and you become a moral transgressor just for asking a question.
That's the key mechanism.
Ah.
Borrowing moral gravity. Because racism, for example, is unequivocally bad and carries this universal social shame, victimhood borrows that gravity.
So if you question the claim of victimhood, even if the circumstances are messy,
You are no longer just skeptical, you are instantly morally suspect. The mechanism weaponizes the universal shame associated with genuine bigotry to protect a, totally unrelated private action.
he calls it an incredibly efficient shield.
And humans, being social creatures, we are very, very adept at using efficient social shields for self-preservation.
The cost of this shortcut, though, this is what Lake says, is the brutal irony. He says that when everyone can flip the badge on demand, the word victim just loses its weight.
It gets cheapened.
Real victims, people who suffered unambiguous, non-negotiable harm, their claims are now automatically suspect.
Because the label is used strategically for arbitrage, and so accountability becomes optional. Responsibility becomes negotiable.
His warning, then, is structural.
It's totally structural. Systems rot when they can no longer distinguish between harm that was done and harm that is strategically claimed.
And the refusal to even entertain the possibility that the protective narrative is a performance?
That's what he calls the architecture of moral failure. And it ends up causing greater harm to the very people the system was originally designed to protect.
So Lake isn't rejecting empathy.
Not at all. He is rejecting asymmetry, the idea that one side of a story is sacred while the other side is interrogated to death.
Okay, but before we dig deeper, it is absolutely crucial that we talk about the constraints he puts on his own analysis.
Yes. He is very explicit about what he is not talking about. And this is to stop the argument from being hijacked by, bad faith readings that try to equate his critique with victim blaming.
We have to emphasize his limitations because they frame the entire discussion.
Right.
So Lake is not discussing minors.
No.
He is not discussing situations involving physical force, explicit coercion, incapacity because of drugs or mental state, or any genuine, actionable fear of physical safety.
He takes all of that off the table because those situations represent unambiguous deprivations of agency.
So his focus is squarely on consenting adults.
Consenting adults making calculated, self-serving choices, often within asymmetrical power dynamics.
And these are choices they later need to account for, but instead, they launder those past decisions through the language of victimhood.
Usually once the outcome turns sour, or more often when the social climate shifts and makes their initial choice inconvenient or embarrassing.
Okay, before we get to arbitrage, I need to stop you. The idea that regret isn't harm is, it's uncomfortable.
It is.
How does Lake navigate that moral gray area where someone feels genuinely harmed, even if the choice was technically consensual? I mean, regret often feels a lot like trauma.
He acknowledges the emotional intensity, but he argues that collapsing that distinction is unethical.
So what's the core truth he's getting at?
The unpopular truth that people dodge. Consent does not evaporate retroactively just because the power dynamic became embarrassing in hindsight.
Or because the benefits you were hoping for didn't materialize.
Exactly. The feeling of regret, no matter how profound it is not the same as the legal or moral reality of having your agency stolen from you.
So Lake is arguing the two are categorically different.
Right, because they require different societal responses. Harm requires intervention and restitution. Regret requires counseling and accountability.
And this distinction relies on his analysis of power versus agency.
It does. Power differentials matter. They have always shaped human interactions, but, and this is his quote, they are not magic spells that erase agency the moment someone regrets the deal they made.
So an adult who chooses to trade things like sex or loyalty or silence for, say, career advantage.
Lake would still classify them as an actor. Maybe a morally questionable actor, sure, and subject to criticism for that choice, but an actor nonetheless.
Because they retain the fundamental ability to choose not to participate.
Exactly. Lake is arguing that a complex choice made under constraint is still a choice, and classifying it as pure coercion actually strips the adult of the very agency they possess.
Which brings us to a crucial concept he introduces, narrative arbitrage.
All right, arbitrage in finance is profiting from a price difference in two markets. So narrative arbitrage is the process of reframing past decisions using newer, higher-value moral language
Language often taken from contemporary social justice movements?
that grants immunity, sympathy, and leverage in the present day.
Okay, let's walk through a specific scenario to make this concrete for the listener.
Good idea.
Imagine a person takes a really lucrative but, ethically questionable job with a shady company. That's the original calculus. They get substantial benefits, wealth, access, prestige.
Oh.
Then, 5 years later, the company gets exposed, the social climate shifts, and any association with that company is now toxic.
So in the process of arbitrage, that individual instantly reframes their past experience,
Not as a choice made out of ambition or greed.
but as exploitation by a toxic system that left them no choice.
And the benefits they received, the money, the access, they become taboo to even discuss.
They're just erased from the narrative. The original intent is laundered, and the new story, the one that grants victim status and moral immunity, gets installed.
And if you question this new narrative, you're instantly labeled as cruel, which obliterates any accountability for the original ethical compromise.
Right. And Lake argues this is a form of double exploitation, which is a deeply unpopular, often shocking idea.
Very.
He suggests that some people exploit systems twice. First, by making that initial unethical choice trading proximity for advantage, for example, knowing the risks.
And then again.
And then again, when the opportunity arises, by weaponizing victim status later, when it's convenient or profitable. Lake stresses that this strategic claiming of harm, especially when it forces bystanders into silence, can be an immoral act in itself.
This is where the demand for symmetry becomes so central to his ethics.
Fits everything.
If you had enough agency to benefit from the initial decision, you have to have enough agency to own the consequences.
Symmetry demands that if person A's past choice is under review, like the shady company, then person B's past conduct has to also be open to review, even if person B is currently holding that moral shield of victimhood.
Lake's goal here isn't cruelty, it's stability.
It's about a basic moral principle. If the moral calculus can just be changed retroactively to avoid accountability, then the whole moral system is unstable and easily gamed.
And he says this position terrifies systems built on optics instead of ethics.
Because it means risking public discomfort for structural integrity.
And that discomfort is precisely why people resort to the psychological tools of guilt and shame to shut this all down.
He calls it crowd control.
The cheapest move in the playbook.
Absolutely. Guilt and shame are the cheapest tool systems use when they don't want to argue on the merits.
So if someone can make you feel morally dirty for asking the question,
Like, what were the benefits you received? Or what was your original intent?
then they never have to answer the question itself. They've successfully shifted the focus from their actions to your critique of their actions.
So wanting accountability isn't cruelty, it's attentiveness. But Lake acknowledges that holding this line costs you social comfort.
It requires acknowledging that morality applies forward and backward, and that sympathy doesn't require amnesia about the original choice.
It's an argument for precision in a culture that, it really thrives on blurring moral lines.
So let's expand on this a bit. To really get the contemporary power of this narrative immunity shield, Lake says we have to look at its historical roots.
Right, how claiming harm became an institutionalized survival tactic within marginalized groups. He analyzes this using the history of LGBTQ communities, but he's very careful to emphasize this is a human problem, not a queer problem.
But the strongest templates for it emerged from genuine necessity.
They had to.
I mean, in the early to mid-20th century, publicly identifying as LGBTQ wasn't just socially risky, it was legally lethal.
Absolutely. Claiming victimhood, being persecuted, pathologized, targeted, it was a legitimate, necessary survival strategy.
In that context, claiming harm actually provided essential legal and social sanctuary. It was often the only way to avoid prison or forced lobotomy.
Job loss, involuntary institutionalization. The system created an enemy and forced people into the role of the damaged party just to survive it.
And that successful survival mechanism became a template.
And that template was really cemented during the gay liberation movement of the 60s and 70s. The narrative of oppression became the rallying cry.
A collective identity that was powerful, portable, and importantly, legible to politicians and the press.
Precisely. This established a precedent where political, legal, and medical context were all closely tied to this perceived victim status. So, for instance, the fight against conversion therapy relied heavily on documenting the trauma inflicted by those practices.
So the ability to articulate systemic harm was essential to winning policy battles and securing basic rights.
The mechanism of claiming harm became institutionalized because it had to be.
So the status of victimhood became powerful and portable through necessity. Lake argues the corrosive effect happens when that powerful moral category moves from a context of existential threat to, well,
To a context of low-stakes professional or social maneuvering.
right.
Because once any powerful moral category becomes institutionalized, it doesn't matter if it's police oversight, tax deductions, or victim status, it becomes gameable.
Because it offers tangible social or economic benefits.
And this is a human problem. If a label grants protection or status or immunity from scrutiny, some percentage of people will inevitably use it strategically, either consciously or unconsciously.
And the effect, regardless of intent, is still corrosive to the whole system and the authenticity of real claims.
The real danger isn't just a few bad actors. Everyone knows some people lie.
So what's the real danger?
The real danger is narrative foreclosure, the institutional mechanism that shuts down inquiry entirely, because questioning intent or agency is instantly equated with bigotry or anti-community action.
And that's how the system ossifies and loses its ability to self-correct.
Right. And Lake then focuses on how this template, the strategic use of victim status for self-preservation, plays out in contemporary settings, often professional or political ones,
He highlights two key modern manifestations.
both revolving around leveraging relational power, where the actual harm is the retrospective reframing.
The first one, which is just rampant in creative fields, academia, and business, is the person in the consensual, mutually beneficial mentor-mentee dynamic who later frames the interaction as exploitation.
Let's unpack that. The relationship often starts with a clear transactional exchange. The mentee offers loyalty, long hours, maybe personal services. The mentor offers access, sponsorship, career ascent.
Yeah.
Both parties calculated the risk and the benefit.
The reframing usually happens when one of three things occurs. The relationship ends badly, the career benefits don't quite materialize, or
External public scrutiny rises dramatically, making the original association embarrassing.
at that point, the sophisticated actor realizes that the moral value of victim status is way higher than the reputational cost of being associated with that original transactional choice.
The agency is retroactively erased, and the mentor is cast as the sole exploiter.
And the second example is more political. You see it in the media all the time. Public figures who, after a clear professional or personal scandal,
Like a corruption charge or exposure of misconduct.
they immediately rebrand themselves as victims of political persecution or cancel culture or systemic bias to try and regain the moral high ground.
And the impact of this is just devastating to public trust.
Because if the public repeatedly sees the victim label being used as an immediate tool for self-preservation and narrative control,
They start to suspect that the label itself isn't a reflection of genuine harm, but just a strategic move. That cynicism harms the credibility of authentic claims.
Lake also points to something he calls narrative arbitration in activism.
Yeah, in this dynamic, activist groups prioritizing group cohesion and solidarity above everything else may instinctively pivot to protecting individuals who engaged in genuinely questionable behavior.
The unstated mentality becomes, we're not here to judge our own members, we're here to protect the community from outside attack.
And that creates a dangerous form of groupthink, where any internal dissent, any attempt at self-accountability is instantly labeled as bigoted, divisive, or anti-community.
So it stifles any clear ethical definition of what actually constitutes harm within the movement.
It leads to a climate of no question that hurts the cause in the long run by making it incapable of structural integrity. They prioritize tactical unity over moral clarity.
So Lake provides what we might call practical indicators for the listener, for you to spot this strategic pattern. This is about developing attentiveness without sacrificing compassion.
The first indicator is rapid identity shift. This is the person moving almost overnight from being the savvy mentor or the self-advocating actor to the traumatized victim after a single incident or disclosure.
The shift is disproportionate to the event itself.
And often relies on language that was never used during the original transaction.
So what's Lake's suggested response?
It's not hostile, it's factual. Asked for specifics. What precisely changed in the relationship to justify this new extreme claim? If the relationship was so damaging, why did the actor continue to seek benefits from it for months or years?
Why is the language of harm only being deployed after the calculation went sour?
Exactly. The logic is that sincere harm narratives tend to be consistent over time, whereas opportunistic narratives are triggered by external events.
Okay, what's the second indicator?
Deflection of responsibility. The claim is often phrased to completely flip the burden of proof. I'm just a victim, so my actions, my prior choices, my previous cooperation, none of it matters.
It's an attempt to use victimhood as a black hole that just sucks in all history and agency.
Right. And the counter here is to encourage what Lake calls a discussion of transparent contextualization.
Meaning a narrative that includes both the before and the after.
Exactly. We acknowledge that agency exists within constraints. We don't live in a lab, but emphasize that agency still exists. Lake stresses that saying, "I regretted the choice," is far more credible than saying, "I had no choice."
And the third indicator,
The use of emotional language as a shield. This is the crowd control mechanism we talked about.
you're attacking me, I'm being harassed.
Or, you are engaging in re-victimization. These are deployed strategically to shut down rational inquiry and impose that procedural paralysis.
The strategy is to conflate a critique of the narrative with an attack on the person's feelings.
And the proper response here is what Lake calls the dual-track solution.
Okay.
You have to acknowledge the feelings being expressed. Of course, that person may feel attacked when questioned, but you also have to demand concrete evidence or documentation for the structural claims being made.
So the solution isn't a compromise, it's a simultaneous commitment.
Exactly. Protecting genuine victims while fostering honest conversations about agency, consent, and accountability.
Because that quality control is what gives the entire system credibility.
Lake insists that if a movement is strong, it can handle internal criticism. If its legitimacy is so fragile that it can't distinguish between opportunistic use and genuine need, then the problem isn't the critique. The problem is the foundation.
So when Lake's argument is put forward in public, the first line of defense against it is often what he calls the cliché criticism.
Yeah, the standard institutional objection. Don't talk about internal failures or the gaming of the system because outsiders might misuse that information to destroy the community.
And Lake strongly counters that this isn't genuine prudence.
No, it's a pressure tactic dressed up as concerned self-protection. He argues this is the same excuse used by every institution throughout history, from churches covering up abuse to police departments shielding misconduct to protect their worst actors.
His blunt truth is essential. Bad actors do not create ammunition. They are the ammunition.
Right. Silence just keeps that ammunition stockpiled until someone hostile fires it for you, usually during a moment of crisis.
And if a community refuses to distinguish between genuine harm and opportunistic reframing, the system just waits for a high-profile case to break.
And then the entire group looks dishonest, defensive, and ethically compromised.
So Lake presents internal policing, or rigorous self-accountability, as essential reputational armor.
He outlines 3 critical benefits. First, it strengthens credibility. A movement that publicly draws a line and says, "We don't defend this specific behavior," is much harder to caricature as a self-serving monolith.
Second, it deprives hostile actors of easy narratives.
When a community polices itself, outsiders lose the ability to accuse them of excusing anything and everything under the banner of identity.
And third, and maybe most importantly, it protects real victims.
Because when false or inflated claims go unchallenged, people become cynical, support erodes, and eventually the most vulnerable pay the price for the opportunism of the loudest. This generalized cynicism is the ultimate tool of oppression.
So Lake calls this opposition to internal policing moral hostage-taking.
Asking people to accept a known injustice, now shielding an opportunist, to avoid a hypothetical injustice later, which is outside criticism.
And his conclusion is pretty stark.
If a community's legitimacy depends on never being questioned, what's actually being preserved isn't justice or vulnerability. It's just the branding and the short-term comfort of group solidarity.
Okay, but cliches are easy to dismiss. Lake recognizes he has to address the more sophisticated counterarguments.
Yes, the steelman version of the critique, which Lake insists we have to acknowledge as intellectually rigorous, even if he ultimately disagrees with its priorities.
So this framework is not stupid, not dishonest, but it relies on different assumptions about risk.
The critics fundamentally believe that Lake's approach creates more danger than it prevents.
So what's the first serious critique?
Asymmetric risk. The critic argues that in a historically unequal world, false negatives, the possibility of silencing a real victim, are categorically worse than false positives, which is occasionally shielding a bad actor.
The powerful survive scrutiny. The marginalized often do not.
Exactly. So any system that raises the evidentiary bar risks silencing the most vulnerable, who may lack the resources or language to navigate a rigorous review.
Okay, and the second critique.
It addresses Lake's strict adult agency line by focusing on ambient power.
The idea that consent isn't a binary switch.
Right, not in a laboratory. Inside unequal systems like workplaces or institutions, choices are meaningfully distorted by things like economic precarity, fear of social exclusion, or just the threat of a powerful person leveraging their capital.
Even without explicit force.
Right. This perspective fears Lake is classifying a kind of legalistic, thin version of consent that ignores a person's lived, constrained reality.
And the third critique is pragmatic. Internal critique rarely stays internal.
Yeah, the critic argues that while accountability might be good for internal integrity in theory, once those difficult, nuanced arguments leak out, all context and nuance just evaporates.
Hostile actors will screenshot, quote, strip, and amplify.
So the critic sees Lake as optimizing for truth under impossible conditions of war, which they see as a category error. Movements are built for solidarity and change, not for running miniature adversarial trials.
So it all boils down to a core conflict.
It does. The serious critic prioritizes error avoidance in one direction, preventing the silencing of a potential victim, even if it means accepting a certain level of narrative ambiguity and opportunism.
Whereas Lake prioritizes long-term credibility, systemic health, and moral symmetry.
Which requires introducing short-term moral discomfort and rigorous questioning.
The critic's sharpest line is undeniably compelling, though.
Which is?
The cost of aggressively filtering claims is paid not by the opportunists, who are usually savvy enough to navigate any system, but by the silent, the unsure, and the already damaged who see that rigorous filtering process and just choose to say nothing.
Lake agrees that's the best articulation of the counterargument, but he immediately zeroes in on what he sees as the structural flaw of the whole framework.
Which is?
The deep embedded assumption that false positives are cheap.
And Lake's arithmetic refutes this.
Absolutely. False positives are not victimless. Shielding a bad actor reshapes the entire trust environment.
Think about it. Once the public sees that accusation alone grants immunity and stops all inquiry, behavior adapts.
Opportunists learn the playbook, cynics disengage, and eventually, even the most sincere claims are met with doubt. Why? Because the system has trained everyone to expect narrative inflation.
And that's how credibility collapses, not from skepticism, but from the systemic overuse of the immunity shield.
He also powerfully challenges the idea that the powerful survive scrutiny, the marginal don't.
He concedes it's often true in traditional power structures.
But he points out the inconvenient fact that in contemporary spaces, narrative power is real power. In modern political, social, and academic contexts, moral framing and the ability to articulate harm, the language of victimhood, can instantly outweigh formal authority, wealth, or structural position.
So a person who is marginalized on one axis can be incredibly dominant in the moral narrative axis.
And ignoring this freezes your analysis in the past.
Furthermore, Lake clarifies his position on external leakage. He's not proposing silence.
No, he's proposing distinction. He says the critic intentionally collapses these two concepts, distinction and silence, because distinction requires difficult, nuanced judgment, and judgment is inherently risky in public.
But if you can't distinguish a true claim from a false one, you protect neither the system nor the genuine victim.
And Lake's conclusion on the critic's framework is damning. A system that cannot tolerate questioning does not empower the marginal. It empowers whoever is most fluent in the language of harm.
Which turns morality into a rhetorical currency, not justice.
And destroys long-term faith in the movement.
The serious critic often accuses Lake of treating consent like a laboratory experiment, saying a choice made under the shadow of a mentor's power isn't a free choice.
Right. They say it's negotiation for survival, and the regret is just delayed clarity about the true cost.
But Lake firmly refutes this as hindsight laundering.
His counter is direct and structural. If regret plus a power imbalance is enough to nullify past consent, then consent only exists for decisions that age well.
So if the outcome is good, the person was savvy and autonomous. If the outcome is bad, they were retroactively helpless.
That's outcome-based moral reassignment, Lake insists, not ethics. It undermines the very concept of adult responsibility.
To test this logic, he uses what he calls the murder analogy.
And he's careful to say he's using it not to equate a regretted choice with a capital crime, but purely as a logical test case for where the annihilation of choice stops.
Right. Murder is a direct violation of agency. Consent is irrelevant because the victim's will is physically overridden.
But a consensual relationship between adults, even with asymmetrical power, is categorically different. The mentee evaluates risks and benefits and makes a choice to proceed. They choose to trade something they have for something they want.
And Lake stresses this is how adult moral responsibility works everywhere else in life.
If the argument holds that the playing field was never level because of wealth or charisma or social capital is enough to negate agency.
Then adults are never responsible for anything they do under any form of disadvantage.
And that's the central hypocrisy Lake highlights. The principle of power overriding agency is only applied selectively, retroactively, and only when the claimant benefits from doing so.
Lake insists that power imbalance constrains choices. It does not annihilate choice.
And morality collapses without stable, symmetrical rules. A system that treats adults as agentic when they err against others, but non-agentic when they err for themselves, is fundamentally incoherent and ripe for systemic corruption.
So we've spent a lot of time focused on the theory of the false positive, the strategic opportunist.
Now Lake pivots to the horrifying consequence of the very system he warns against, the true negative.
This is where we look at the monumental, crushing cost of narrative inertia, and he illustrates it with the case of Robert Du Bois.
This is a case of unambiguous systemic damage, a man crushed by the refusal of the justice system to question its own assumptions.
So, in 1983, Robert Du Bois was just 18 years old in Tampa, Florida. He was arrested for the murder and sexual assault of a 19-year-old woman, Barbara Grams.
His conviction and his subsequent death sentence in 1985 relied primarily on two deeply flawed pieces of evidence.
First, the bite mark evidence.
A forensic odontologist, Dr. Richard Souviron, declared that a mark on the victim matched Du Bois's teeth to a reasonable degree of dental certainty.
That statement of certainty was effectively narrative immunity for the investigation.
It was. And second, there was a jailhouse informant, a man named Claude Butler, who was facing 2 life sentences. He testified that Robert had confessed to him, and Butler received benefits for that self-serving testimony.
And that was the entire case. A questionable identification based on teeth, framed as scientific certainty and testimony from a person with a massive motive to lie.
Du Bois spent 3 years on death row before his sentence was vacated on a technicality, but he remained in prison for 37 years, consistently maintaining his innocence.
He was trapped in the system's narrative inertia.
And the scientific community knew this was bad science. Forensic science advanced dramatically, and by the 2000s, bite mark analysis was widely known to be subjective, unreliable, and prone to catastrophic error.
The American Board of Forensic Odontology even revised its standards.
They did. They explicitly advised against making unconditional identifications. It had become consensus that this evidence was junk science.
Yet, because the system had accepted that original certain narrative, Du Bois remained locked up.
The original claim had achieved institutional immunity.
So the change came in 2018, almost 4 decades later, when the Hillsborough County State Attorney's Office established a Conviction Review Unit, or CRU.
The Innocence Project pushed for a review of Du Bois's case, knowing it rested on those 2 unreliable pillars: faulty forensics and compromised jailhouse informants.
So the first review was of the initial scientific claim.
A new odontologist, Dr. Adam Freeman, reviewed the evidence from the original trial, and his conclusion was staggering.
What did he find?
The injury that supposedly matched Du Bois's teeth. It wasn't even a bite mark in the first place. The pattern that had sent Du Bois to death row simply didn't exist as forensic evidence.
He had been convicted based on something that was factually not there, all accepted under the guise of dental certainty.
But still, the DNA evidence was missing. Officials had claimed the original rape kit evidence had been destroyed back in 1990.
Then, in 2020, investigators made a discovery.
Long-forgotten slides from the original autopsy, previously thought destroyed, were found at the medical examiner's office.
And those slides were tested.
The DNA results completely excluded Du Bois.
And instead,
they matched 2 other men, Amos Robinson and Abron Scott, who were already serving life sentences for an unrelated murder they'd committed in 1983.
The real killers had been in the system all along.
So on August 27, 2020, Robert Du Bois, at age 55, walked free after 37 years of wrongful imprisonment.
But even after his physical release, there was one final, staggering injustice.
The moment where the bureaucratic system prioritized paper purity over moral reality.
Du Bois was initially disqualified from receiving the $50,000 per year state compensation, potentially up to $2 million, because of Florida's clean hands provision.
They admitted they ruined his life based on fake science, but argued over minor, nonviolent felonies he committed when he was 17.
It's just cold bureaucratic cruelty.
And Lake calls that moment bureaucratic morality at its finest. The state admitted ruining his life, but sought to invoke an adolescent technicality to avoid financial accountability.
That bureaucratic indifference is the systemic cost of narrative foreclosure.
The state was determined to find some way to maintain moral superiority, even against a man they had irrevocably damaged.
Thankfully, public outrage forced action.
Florida eventually changed its law, and Du Bois received the compensation. He also won a massive $14 million settlement from the city of Tampa and others in 2024.
And his case prompted the first systematic review of bite mark convictions by a prosecutor's office,
Confirming that Du Bois was crushed by unearned confidence and narrative inertia.
So Lake connects Du Bois's fate directly back to the central thesis of his paper.
Right. Du Bois was convicted because the bite mark analysis was socially useful. It provided certainty where none existed, it gave prosecutors a clear story, and it gave juries a feeling of resolution.
Questioning the expert was framed as obstruction to justice. Error, once framed as fact, calcified into immutable truth.
The danger zone is mapped by combining these two structural failures. Du Bois represents the true negative, the innocent man unjustly blamed because the system prioritized narrative certainty over rigorous fact-finding.
And Lake's original arguments address false positives. The opportunists claiming victimhood to escape accountability, forcing the system to prioritize narrative comfort over necessary questioning.
And Lake argues that the failure mode is structurally identical in both cases.
How so?
When we allow narrative immunity for the false positives, the opportunists who game the system, we inevitably build the very machinery, the refusal to question, the prioritization of the sacred narrative, that creates the true negatives, the Du Boises.
It's the same cognitive failure.
In the case of Du Bois, the system wouldn't question the scientific expert because it would unravel the entire murder narrative.
And in the case of narrative immunity, the system won't question the victim claimant because it would unravel the moral framework they want to protect.
The structural defense against questioning is the same.
This leads to Lake's final chilling warning.
A system that cannot tell when someone is strategically lying eventually loses the ability to see when someone is genuinely telling the truth, or when an innocent person is screaming their innocence.
The only solution, the thing that corrects the system, is the forbidden sentence. What if the story is wrong?
That sentence is always unpopular. It always sounds cruel in the moment because it introduces doubt into certainty.
But Lake argues, and Du Bois's case proves, that questioning certainty is the only thing that ultimately fixes anything and ensures that justice applies equally to the opportunist and the truly innocent. So what does this all mean for you, the listener, navigating a world where information and moral claims are flying at you constantly?
The core argument here, it isn't about being heartless or lacking empathy.
It's about the necessity of precision and the realization that morality just collapses under unstable, asymmetrical rules.
Lake is arguing that moral rules have to be stable and symmetrical if they are to withstand systemic corruption and opportunism.
The real argument, Lake concludes, isn't ultimately about easily gathered facts. We can get the DNA evidence eventually.
It's about which failure mode you are willing to live with as a society, because every system has a failure mode.
Are you optimizing for immediate social comfort and guaranteed disclosure, even if that risks false positives, breeds long-term cynicism, and sacrifices integrity?
Or are you optimizing for sustainable credibility and moral symmetry, even if it requires short-term discomfort and the difficult, socially taxing act of questioning a protective narrative?
The incentives built into our social systems govern accountability. And until we are brave enough to ask the questions that challenge the moral shortcuts,
The question, what if the story is wrong?
we run the risk of sustaining narrative immunity for opportunists on one side, while inadvertently creating more systemic injustices, more true negatives on the other, something to mull over as you observe the public debate.